How instrumental were your parents in your $31 million journey? The reporter held the microphone inches from my face. Camera flashes fired in quick succession, blinding white bursts, reflecting off the crystal chandeliers of the Willow Creek Children's Hospital Charity Gala. I stood on the red carpet in a silk gown, the guest of honor. My mother stood right beside me. She had crashed the interview, throwing her arm around my shoulders, smiling a perfect porcelain smile for the press. She had just finished telling the cameras how she supported my dreams. I did not argue with her. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my clutch, pulled out my phone, and held it up to the reporter's microphone. I pressed play on a voicemail I had saved. My father's voice echoed through the PA system, raw and jagged. "Leave now, you uneducated trash. You are a loser and a permanent stain on this family." The silence that fell over the ballroom was heavy. The reporter lowered the microphone. My mother dropped her arm from my shoulder, the color draining from her face, as 200 of the wealthiest people in New Jersey stared at her. To understand how my father's screaming hijacked a charity event, we have to go back exactly 4 weeks. Welcome back to Olivia Stories Revenge, the channel where we explore the quiet strength it takes to walk away and the undeniable satisfaction of setting the record straight. Before we get into the details of what happened next, drop a comment and tell me how old you are today. It helps us connect with listeners who have lived through these kinds of family trials. 4 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday evening, I stood in the foyer of my parents' home in an affluent New Jersey suburb. The air smelled of lemon polish and expensive candles. A heavy canvas duffel bag hit the imported hardwood floor, sliding until it bumped against my shoes. My father, Richard, stood at the bottom of the stairs, breathing heavily. My mother, Helen, stood off to the side, her arms crossed tight over her chest. I had spent the last 21 days sleeping on a pull-out sofa in the guest room, changing her bandages and bringing her meals after her hip surgery. The very hour her doctor cleared her to walk unassisted, she decided my usefulness had expired. Standing behind my mother was my older sister, Julianne. Julianne wore a tailored navy blazer and pearls, her standard armor for her role as an Ivy League-educated corporate consultant. She looked at me the way you look at a smudge on a clean window. "Get your things and get out," my father said. "You are 28 years old and you have nothing to show for it. No degree, no career. Just sitting in a bedroom typing on that garbage computer. We are done funding a dropout." I looked at the canvas bag at my feet. I did not cry. I did not ask for a few more days. I knelt down and unzipped the front pocket of the bag just enough to verify one specific item was safe. It was a scratched 2018 Dell laptop. The lid was covered in faded stickers. The hinges were loose. To my family, it was a symbol of my failure. To me, it was the vault holding the source code for Logisync AI, the supply chain software I had built from scratch. "Fine by me," I said. I zipped the bag, stood up, and opened the front door. The autumn air was crisp. I walked to my car without looking back. My parents thought I was heading to a cheap motel or a friend's couch. They thought I would call them in 3 days, pleading for a loan. They had no idea I was driving straight to a glass skyscraper in Jersey City, where a private elevator opened directly into my penthouse. But more importantly, they had no idea that I had left a single piece of misdirected mail in my old bedroom. A piece of mail Julianne would find the very next morning, triggering a chain of events that would expose every lie they had ever told. I drove north on the turnpike, leaving the quiet, tree-lined streets of the suburbs behind. The landscape shifted, the dark outlines of residential neighborhoods giving way to the bright, towering steel spine of Jersey City. I pulled my car into the secured underground garage of my building. The night attendant offered a polite nod, stepping out of his booth to scan my credentials and press the button for the private executive elevator. The doors closed, sealing me in a quiet, wood-paneled box that hummed softly as it ascended. 90 floors above the Hudson River, the elevator doors slid open directly into my foyer. I stepped onto the wide plank oak flooring and walked into the kitchen. I dropped the heavy canvas duffel bag onto the ground. I unzipped the front compartment, pulled out the scratched 2018 Dell laptop and set it on the custom Calcutta marble island. The stone was cool under my palms. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Manhattan skyline glittered against the black sky, a sprawling grid of light and ambition. The silence inside my penthouse was profound, a sharp contrast to the screaming I had just endured. Looking at the battered plastic casing of that computer brought an old memory rushing forward. 9 years ago, I was 19 years old, sitting in the cramped bedroom I had just been evicted from. It was 3 a.m. My neck was stiff and my fingers ached from typing lines of Python code for hours on end. I was trying to build a predictive routing algorithm, the very digital framework that would eventually become the foundation of LogiSync AI. Downstairs, the house was ablaze with light and noise. My parents were hosting a catered celebration. Julianne had just received her acceptance letter to a prestigious business program. I remember opening my bedroom door and stepping out onto the carpeted landing, looking down over the wooden banister. My father stood in the center of the living room, holding up a crystal champagne flute. He delivered a grand speech about legacy intelligence and securing the family reputation. Then he reached into his tailored suit pocket and pulled out a silver keyring. He handed Julianne the keys to a brand-new German sedan. The room erupted in applause. My mother wept with pride. I watched from the shadows, unnoticed. I turned around, walked back into my room, shut the door, and went back to writing code. They had purchased her a status symbol. I was building an empire. I did not harbor anger over that night anymore. Anger requires an emotional investment I prefer to spend on board meetings and software deployments. But while I was standing in my kitchen brewing espresso the morning after my eviction, my sister was busy erasing my existence from our parents' house. Julianne never liked my childhood room. It was small and faced the neighbor's wooden fence, but it was the only space left for her to convert into a home office. Her consulting firm allowed her to work remote 2 days a week, and she firmly believed a senior consultant needed a dedicated space that reflected her corporate standing. She started clearing out the closet before my father even dragged the garbage bins to the curb. She tossed my leftover wire hangers into a plastic bin, treating my lingering presence like contaminated waste. She wiped down the wooden shelves with a harsh chemical cleaner, eager to sanitize the space. When she reached the top shelf, pushed far back into a dark corner, her hand brushed against something thick. It was an envelope. The paper was heavy off-white and textured with a distinct official watermark. The return address in the upper left corner read, Department of the Treasury, Internal Revenue Service. It had been forwarded from my original post office box, a minor clerical delay from when I updated my primary corporate domicile the previous quarter. Julianne stood still, staring at the government seal. Federal law dictates you do not open mail addressed to someone else. My sister, however, considered rules applicable only to people who lacked her pedigree. She slid her perfectly manicured thumbnail under the flap and tore the heavy paper open. She pulled out a 3-page document. It was a standard corporate tax liability statement for LogiSync. The paperwork detailed estimated quarterly obligations based on current revenue projections and recent venture capital influx. The number at the bottom of the second page was staggering. It contained 7 zeros. Julianne is a consultant. She builds presentation decks filled with corporate jargon, synergy strategies, and market optimizations. She tells other businesses how to cut corners, but she does not handle actual financial architecture. She scanned the dense legal text. She looked at the word liability printed in bold ink. She looked at the 8-figure sum resting at the bottom of the column. Her brain, conditioned by years of viewing me as uneducated and inferior, processed the information through a lens of pure prejudice. She did not see a thriving tech company paying its required share of federal taxes on record-breaking profits. She saw a catastrophic, life-ruining debt. She assumed I had taken out terrible, predatory loans to fund a fake business venture and had defaulted on a spectacular scale. She assumed the government was hunting me down and that I had used our parents' address to hide from creditors. Julianne stood in the center of my old bedroom holding a legal document that proved my net worth rivaled the gross domestic product of a small island nation. Yet all she felt was the thrill of vindication. Her lips curled into a sharp, tight smile. She traced the printed zeros with her index finger, her heart racing with excitement. This was the ultimate weapon. This was tangible, irrefutable proof that the family scapegoat was exactly what they always said she was: a failure, a financial disaster, a burden trying to drag their pristine reputation through the mud. She did not toss the document in the shredder. She did not pick up her phone to call me to ask if I needed help navigating a financial crisis or hiring a lawyer. She folded the heavy paper back into neat thirds, creasing the edges sharply. She walked over to her designer leather handbag sitting on my old mattress and slipped the envelope into the zippered side pocket. She patted the leather smooth, securing her prize. This was not something to be discussed in private over a quiet cup of coffee. This was a trophy, and Julianne knew exactly where she intended to display it. Her husband Bradley was hosting a lavish dinner party that coming weekend. My parents were invited, the wine would be flowing, the crystal glasses would be polished, and the dining room would be full of eager listeners. It was the perfect stage to present her findings and publicly execute my character. Saturday evening arrived with a bitter chill in the air. Inside Julianne and Bradley's colonial-style home, the dining room was heated by a roaring gas fireplace. The long mahogany table was set for 4, decorated with tall taper candles and heavy silver cutlery. A prime rib roast rested on a silver platter in the center of the table, emitting the rich fragrance of seared garlic and crushed rosemary. Yet beneath the aroma of expensive food lingered the distinct scent of unearned superiority. Bradley poured his 3rd glass of Cabernet. Bradley was a regional branch manager at a mid-tier bank, a man who wore fleece vests on Sunday mornings and treated his golf handicap as a substitute for an actual personality. His face was flushed from the wine and the warmth of the fire. He swirled the dark liquid in his crystal glass, nodding along as Richard complained loudly about the rising cost of property taxes in their neighborhood. Julianne waited until the dinner plates were cleared to make her grand presentation. She thrived on capturing the attention of the room, treating every family gathering like a boardroom pitch where she was the star executive. She stood up from her chair, walked over to the antique credenza near the hallway, and retrieved her designer leather handbag. She returned to her seat and placed the textured off-white envelope onto the polished wood. The federal seal faced upward, catching the flickering light of the candles. "I found this hidden in the back of her old closet," Julianne announced. Her voice was pitched in a tone of grave concern that fooled absolutely no one at the table. Helen leaned forward, her eyes narrowing at the government emblem. Richard set his linen napkin down. Julianne slid the 3-page document from the envelope and spread the thick papers flat on the table. She pointed a French manicured finger directly at the bottom line of the 2nd page. "She is drowning," Julianne sneered, tapping her nail against the paper. "Look at this number." Richard reached into his breast pocket and put on his reading glasses. He stared at the 8-figure sum resting beneath the bold heading of Estimated Corporate Tax Liability. The cognitive bias in the room was so thick it distorted their perception of reality. None of them owned a business larger than a suburban lemonade stand. They saw the word liability and assumed it meant a catastrophic, unmanageable penalty. They saw the staggering string of zeros and immediately concluded I was the victim of a predatory lending scheme, or worse, the target of a federal investigation for unpaid personal debts. The dramatic irony hung heavy over the dining table. The audience watching this scene unfold knows the truth. Those 4 people were gloating over a standard tax receipt generated by a highly lucrative tech empire. They were looking at a document that proved my company was generating astronomical revenue, yet they were interpreting my monumental success as my ultimate ruin. "I knew it," Helen whispered. She pressed a hand to her chest, exhaling a long breath that sounded like pure, unadulterated relief. "I told you both she was making a mistake dropping out of school. Now she is hiding from the government. She was probably using our home address to dodge collection agencies. Richard shook his head, his face flushing with righteous indignation. We did the right thing kicking her out when we did. If we had let her stay another month, they might have come after our assets to settle her mess. We dodged a bullet. Bradley leaned back in his upholstered dining chair, letting out a deep, booming laugh. He found the idea of my financial destruction incredibly entertaining. As he chuckled, his shoulders shook, and he gestured loosely with his wineglass. A single drop of dark red Cabernet escaped the crystal rim. It fell through the air and landed directly on the crisp, watermarked paper of the IRS document. The ruby liquid seeped into the expensive fiber, blooming over the black ink. Bradley did not apologize. He did not reach for a cloth to wipe it away. He left the stain right there, a careless and permanent mark on a financial ledger that represented more capital than he would earn in 10 lifetimes. The conversation shifted from my supposed downfall to their own brilliance. They spent the next hour congratulating themselves on their foresight and financial prudence. But for Helen, private validation was never quite enough. A narcissist does not simply want to win in the dark. They require an audience to witness their victory. Helen realized that simply evicting me lacked the theatrical flair she craved. She needed the women at her country club to see my failure firsthand. She wanted to play the role of the tragic, generous mother, extending a lifeline to her broken child. She decided that simple banishment was insufficient. I needed to be publicly shamed. Helen picked up her smartphone from the table. She began crafting a text message designed to sound like an olive branch, though it was laced with pure venom. She typed out a demand for me to attend the upcoming Ridgewood Country Club luncheon. She framed it not as an invitation, but as an inescapable obligation. "You need to show your face and repay your debt to this family," she wrote. She hit send, smiling at the glowing screen. Miles away, the city hummed with quiet efficiency. I was sitting at the Calcutta Marble Island in my Jersey City penthouse. The morning light poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the intricate wireframes displayed on my dual monitors. The climate control system breathed a soft, steady stream of cool air into the silent room. My phone vibrated against the stone counter. I picked up the device and read my mother's message. I did not frown. My pulse did not quicken. I stared at the glowing screen with clinical detachment. The demand was entirely transparent. She wanted to drag me into her arena, surround me with her wealthy peers, and parade me around as a cautionary tale. She wanted me to feel small so she could feel large. I could have blocked her number right then. I could have sent a screenshot of my bank account balance and shattered her delusion from the comfort of my own kitchen. But that is not how you handle people who thrive on manipulation. When an antagonist is eager to dig a hole, you do not take the shovel out of their hands. You offer them a bigger shovel. I set my coffee mug down. I opened the keyboard on my screen. I did not type a paragraph defending my honor. I did not ask for an apology or demand an explanation for the eviction. I typed a single, brief sentence confirming I would be there at noon on Thursday. I hit send, locking the phone and setting it aside. I turned my attention back to the logistics algorithms rendering on my computer. The trap was set, but Helen had fundamentally misunderstood who was the predator and who was the prey. She believed she was luring a desperate, indebted dropout into a den of lions. She had no idea she had just invited the apex predator into her fragile glass house. I accepted the invitation, setting the stage for a luncheon where suburban illusions were destined to be shattered. Thursday at noon arrived under a canopy of gray clouds. The tires of my sedan crunched against the pristine white gravel of the Ridgewood Country Club driveway. I handed my keys to a valet wearing a crisp uniform, stepped out of the vehicle, and took a slow breath of the damp autumn air. The club was a sprawling brick estate, a monument to suburban climbing that smelled of bleached linens, aged leather, and eager ambition. It was the sort of place where membership was leveraged to prove status rather than enjoy leisure. I chose my wardrobe for the afternoon with deliberate care. I wore a simple, unbranded beige knit sweater, paired with matching tailored trousers. There were no flashy hardware accents, no visible labels, and no loud patterns. To an untrained eye, it resembled something purchased from a mid-tier department store clearance rack. In reality, the garments were spun from pure Loro Piana cashmere, woven in Italy from the rarest Hercus goat underfleece. It was temperature-regulating, impossibly soft, and represented the pinnacle of quiet luxury. It was the uniform of the apex tier, a silent signal recognized only by those who resided in the same tax bracket. My mother waited for me inside the grand mahogany doors of the lobby. Julianne stood next to her, clutching the hands of her two young sons, Leo and Max. The toddlers were dressed in stiff, uncomfortable formal wear, their tiny bow ties sitting crooked against their collars. They tugged restlessly at Julianne's skirt. Helen's eyes swept over my attire. Her lips pressed into a thin line of profound disappointment. She herself was dripping in recognizable branding. A belt buckle, shaped like a giant designer initial, rested at her waist. Her purse was covered in a famous monogram grid. She projected the illusion of wealth through sheer volume, unaware that true capital never needs to scream for attention. "You actually wore that," Helen sighed, shaking her head. "I suppose we cannot expect you to afford anything better right now. Just try to blend into the background." She turned to Julianne, giving her an encouraging nod, then looked back at me. "Julianne and I have an important networking luncheon today. The mayor's wife is here, along with several key clients from Bradley's bank. You are going to take the boys to the back table and keep them quiet. We cannot have distractions while we secure our social standing." The trap sprang shut with a metallic snap. Helen had not invited me to share a meal or mend our fractured relationship. She had summoned me to act as unpaid childcare, a human shield to protect her networking efforts from the chaos of her own grandchildren. She wanted me hidden in the corner, a visible testament to my lowered rank within the family hierarchy. I accepted the heavy canvas diaper bag from Julianne without a single word of protest. The bag smelled of sterile baby wipes and spilled apple juice. I took Leo by his left hand and guided Max with my right. I walked them past the grand dining area, past the crystal chandeliers and the clinking silver cutlery, navigating toward a small, isolated table situated directly next to the swinging kitchen doors. It was a spot reserved for hired help and unruly dependents, noisy with the constant clatter of porcelain dishes being stacked by busboys. I settled the boys into their high chairs and unpacked a small cardboard box of crayons onto the white tablecloth. While the toddlers began to color, I allowed my gaze to drift across the dining room. Helen was in her element. She moved from table to table, holding a mimosa, ensuring her voice carried over the ambient chatter. "She is going through a very tough transition," I heard Helen say to a woman wearing an oversized sun hat. "It breaks a mother's heart, but dropping out of school has severe consequences. We are just doing our best to provide her with some structure and purpose today." Helen played the tragic martyr beautifully. She harvested pity from the other wives, utilizing my supposed downfall as social currency to elevate her own prestige. Instead of seething with resentment, I detached my emotions from the spectacle. I shifted my focus to the table in front of me. Leo had dumped his crayons and they rolled across the linen. I picked up a fractured piece of green wax. It lacked a paper wrapper and the tip was blunt from heavy use. I pulled a square embossed cocktail napkin from beneath my water goblet and smoothed it flat. My mind returned to the predictive routing architecture I had been rendering in my penthouse that morning. LogiSync AI was facing a complex bottleneck in final mile delivery optimization. I needed to draft a heuristic equation to account for variable transit delays. I pressed the blunt green crayon against the delicate paper. The wax was clumsy, but the logic was flawless. I began sketching out the structural nodes connecting data points with fluid, rapid strokes. I wrote out the algorithm, filling the white space with advanced calculus and predictive modeling frameworks. The contrast between the medium and the message was striking. I was outlining a software solution worth millions, using a broken toy meant for a 3-year-old. The numbers centered me, grounding my thoughts in empirical truth, while the suburban circus swirled around my table. 30 minutes passed. The ambient noise in the dining room suddenly dipped. The shift in atmosphere was palpable, like the barometric pressure dropping before a summer storm. I glanced up from my napkin. A man had just entered the Ridgewood Country Club, and his presence commanded immediate, silent attention. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit tailored to perfect precision, paired with a crisp white shirt left open at the collar. He carried no briefcase and wore no recognizable watch. His name was Marcus Sterling. He was a prominent venture capitalist from Manhattan, a kingmaker in the tech finance sector, known for funding unicorns and dismantling obsolete corporations. The local real estate developers and mid-tier bank executives scrambled to intercept him. They approached with eager smiles, offering extended hands and rehearsed elevator pitches. Marcus navigated the room with polite indifference. He offered brief nods, but did not stop to engage. He brushed past the elite members, his eyes scanning the perimeter. He appeared to be looking for a quiet moment, or perhaps just a glass of water from the service station. His path directed him toward the swinging kitchen doors. He walked past Helen, who was frozen mid-sentence, staring at him with desperate awe. He kept walking until he reached the perimeter of the children's area. Marcus paused. He stood 2 feet away from my chair. He was not looking at me. His sharp, calculating eyes were locked on the cocktail napkin resting near my elbow. He stared at the green wax. He traced the visual flow of the heuristic equation, reading the complex math I had casually drafted. He understood exactly what those numbers represented. He recognized the elegant solution to the supply chain bottleneck. Marcus slowly lifted his gaze from the napkin to my face. The recognition clicked into place, illuminating his features. He ignored the crowded room, ignored the eager executives, and ignored my mother watching from a few yards away. He stepped forward and extended his right hand toward me. "Acacia," he said, his voice booming clear and steady across the silent dining room. I certainly did not expect to find the chief executive officer of Logisync hiding in the back corner of a country club. The syllables of my title hung in the humid air of the dining room. Marcus Sterling kept his hand extended, his posture radiating professional deference. He did not care that I was sitting next to a stack of high chairs, nor did he care that my canvas bag smelled of toddler snacks. He recognized the architect behind a software infrastructure that was currently disrupting the national logistics grid. I reached out and accepted his handshake. His grip was firm, a silent transmission of mutual respect between two people who understood the brutal arithmetic of building an empire from the ground up. A few yards away, the crystal stem of a champagne flute slipped through my mother's fingers. Helen caught the glass just before it shattered against the hardwood floor, spilling a ribbon of pale gold liquid over her knuckles. Her brain simply rejected the sensory input she had just received. The psychological framework she had constructed required me to be a failure. If the man standing before me, a titan of Manhattan finance, considered me a peer, then her entire narrative collapsed. To protect her fragile ego, her mind instantly manufactured an alternate reality. She convinced herself Marcus was mistaken, the victim of a bizarre coincidence or a misplaced joke. She set her glass onto a passing busboy's tray and hurried toward the children's table. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor in a frantic, uneven rhythm. She bypassed the local politicians and the bank executives, inserting herself directly between Marcus and my chair. "Mr. Sterling," Helen said, her voice pitched an octave higher than usual, breathless and laced with an artificial, sugary charm. "I am so sorry for the intrusion. You must have confused my daughter with someone of consequence. This is Acacia. She is just keeping the boys entertained while we handle our business today." Marcus slowly retracted his hand. He looked at Helen, taking in the designer logo buckled at her waist and the nervous, desperate shine in her eyes. He was a man who spent his days dissecting corporate hierarchies, identifying the weak links in management teams, and evaluating human behavior under pressure. It took him less than 3 seconds to read the toxic architecture of my family dynamic. He glanced down at the cocktail napkin resting on the white tablecloth, noting the complex heuristic equations sketched in green wax. Then he looked back at me. I maintained a neutral expression. I gave him a single, deliberate nod. It was a silent request, a quiet boundary drawn in the air. I did not need him to fight my battles or validate my status to a woman incapable of grasping it. Marcus understood. A faint, knowing smile touched the corners of his mouth. "My mistake," Marcus said smoothly, his tone shifting into polite detachment. He addressed Helen, but his eyes never left mine. "Enjoy your afternoon, Acacia. Keep building." He turned and walked away, navigating through the sea of desperate suburbanites without granting them a single moment of his time. He vanished through the lobby doors, leaving a profound vacuum in his wake. The ambient chatter of the country club slowly returned, but the atmosphere at our table had curdled into something bitter. Helen stood frozen, staring at the empty space Marcus had occupied. Her face flushed a deep mottled red from her collarbone to her hairline. She could not comprehend why a billionaire had spoken to her disgraced child, nor could she tolerate the lingering respect in his final words. Rather than question her own assumptions, she weaponized her confusion, transforming her embarrassment into furious indignation. "You think this is a game?" Helen hissed, leaning over the table so her words would not carry to the neighboring diners. Julianne rushed over, abandoning her networking targets to flank our mother. "I do not know what kind of stunt you pulled to make that man mock you." Helen continued, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of my table. "But you just humiliated this family in front of the entire Ridgewood membership. We brought you here out of pity, and you repay us by making a spectacle of yourself?" I wiped a smudge of green wax from my thumb. I did not offer an explanation. I did not mention the Wall Street Journal feature that had run the previous month, nor did I explain that Marcus Sterling had tried and failed to secure an early equity stake in my company. Let her believe it was a cruel joke. The truth would require an intellectual capacity she simply did not possess. "You are going to take responsibility for this disaster," Helen commanded. She flagged down a passing waiter with a sharp snap of her fingers. She demanded the check for the entire luncheon, instructing the young man to bring the folio directly to my table. "You are paying for our meals today. Consider it a penalty for your behavior." The waiter returned moments later, placing a black leather folio onto the table beside my water goblet. The gold-embossed logo of the country club shimmered under the chandeliers. Inside, the printed receipt detailed a total of $412, accounting for the mimosas, the prime rib salads, and the mandatory gratuity. To a 28-year-old unemployed dropout, a $400 unexpected expense is a devastating blow. It is the kind of financial shock that ruins a monthly budget and forces humiliating phone calls to utility companies. Helen waited for my reaction. She wanted to see panic. She wanted to watch my hands shake as I realized I could not cover the cost of her vengeance. I did not argue. I did not plead for leniency. I simply reached down and picked up my unbranded leather handbag. The bag contained no visible hardware and no designer tags. Inside, nestled next to a spare charging cable and my keys, was a slim card holder. I bypassed my standard debit cards and my corporate expense accounts. I slid my index finger into the back slot and extracted a sleek, rectangular piece of anodized titanium. It was the American Express Centurion. The card is not something a person applies for. It is an invite-only financial instrument extended exclusively to individuals whose annual spending and liquid assets cross an astronomical threshold. It weighs exactly 14 grams, significantly heavier than standard plastic. It carries no spending limit. It represents an ecosystem of wealth that exists entirely outside the comprehension of the suburban upper middle class. I held the metal card between my fingers, feeling the cool, matte finish. I extended my arm and let it drop onto the mahogany table next to the leather folio. The titanium hit the wood with a heavy, distinct metallic thud. The sound cut through the ambient noise of clinking silverware. It was not the hollow clatter of plastic. It was the undeniable weight of solid metal. Julianne stared at the black rectangle. She worked in high-level corporate consulting. She spent her days drafting proposals for chief financial officers and managing partners. She had seen one of these cards before, resting on the desk of a senior equity partner at her firm. She recognized the intricate silver bordering and the centered gladiator profile. The color drained from Julianne's face. Her eyes widened, shifting rapidly from the titanium card to my calm, unbothered expression. The gears in her mind began to grind, against the horrific possibility that the tax document she had stolen from my bedroom was not a notice of default. Helen, however, lacked Julianne's corporate exposure. Helen operated on the assumption that anything she did not personally understand must be invalid. She looked at the heavy black card, her lips curling into a sneer of pure, unfiltered disgust. "What is this nonsense?" Helen scoffed, pointing a manicured finger at the table. "Do you expect them to accept a prop? You probably bought this fake metal garbage off the internet to try and look important." She reached across the table, her fingers closing tightly around the titanium edge. She lifted the card, weighing it in her palm, her face twisted in a mask of vindictive triumph. She believed she had finally caught me in a desperate, pathetic lie. "This is plastic trash wrapped in foil," Helen declared, her voice rising in volume, intentionally drawing the attention of the surrounding tables. She turned toward the waiter, who had been standing a few feet away, holding her arm high in the air, determined to expose my fraudulent existence to the entire dining room. "Do not bother running that," Helen instructed the young waiter, her voice carrying a sharp theatrical edge designed to reach the neighboring tables. "It is plastic garbage." With a flick of her wrist, my mother tossed the titanium rectangle back across the mahogany surface. The heavy metal spun end over end, catching the glow of the overhead chandeliers before coming to a sudden halt mere inches from my water goblet. She did not recognize the weight. Her prejudice was a thick armor, repelling any evidence that contradicted her deeply held narrative. Helen opened her monogrammed purse and extracted her own credit card. It was a standard silver piece of plastic, the kind issued by regional banks that signaled upper-middle-class comfort but demanded exorbitant interest rates. She held it out to the waiter with a practiced flourish, raising her chin to ensure the women seated nearby could witness her profound generosity. "Put the entire bill on my account," Helen declared, her tone dripping with manufactured martyrdom. "I am happy to support my delusional daughter. She is going through a very difficult phase right now, and sometimes a mother simply has to step in and absorb the cost of these little fantasies." The waiter, a college student caught in the crossfire of a suburban Cold War, looked terrified. He glanced at the titanium card resting on the table, then at the silver plastic in my mother's outstretched hand. He chose the path of least resistance, taking Helen's card and retreating quickly toward the service station. I did not offer a defense. I did not explain the rigorous financial vetting required to possess an American Express Centurion. I reached forward, picked up the cool metal, and slid it back into the hidden slot of my leather wallet. A fundamental rule of strategic negotiation is never interrupting an opponent while they are busy destroying their own credibility. Helen wanted to pay the $400 bill. I was more than willing to let her absorb the expense. A heavy, uncomfortable silence settled over our table. Julianne sat rigidly in her chair. Her eyes remained fixed on the spot where the black card had rested just moments before. Unlike our mother, Julianne worked in the financial district. She had spent years drafting proposals and analyzing equity structures. She knew exactly how a titanium card sounded when it struck solid wood. The seed of terror had been planted in her mind, but she lacked the courage to voice her realization. Instead, she smoothed her linen napkin over her lap, desperately trying to maintain the illusion of control. 10 minutes passed. The rhythmic clinking of silverware and the low hum of country club gossip resumed around us. Helen took small, satisfied sips of her water, radiating the smug contentment of a woman who believed she had just won a decisive victory. Her triumph was interrupted by the arrival of the general manager. Mr. Harrington was a fixture at the Ridgewood Country Club, a man possessing decades of experience managing the fragile egos of the local elite. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and moved with silent, practiced efficiency. He knew the net worth of every member in the building, and more importantly, he knew the difference between leveraged debt and liquid capital. He had been standing near the lobby entrance when Marcus Sterling walked in. He had witnessed the venture capitalists bypass the town's wealthiest developers to shake my hand. He had also watched from a distance as my mother threw a Centurion card across the table. Mr. Harrington stopped at the edge of our table. He carried a slim, black leather booklet. He did not hand it to the young waiter to deliver. He chose to present it himself. He opened the booklet and placed it gently in front of Helen. Inside rested her silver credit card and a long strip of crinkled thermal paper. The receipt curled slightly at the edges, smelling faintly of warm ink and chemical coating. "Your transaction is complete, Mrs. Simmons," Mr. Harrington said. His voice was perfectly level, devoid of any discernible emotion. Helen smiled, picking up a pen to sign the thermal paper. "Thank you, Arthur. Excellent service today, despite the chaotic circumstances at our table." Mr. Harrington did not smile back. He clasped his hands behind his back. "I must also deliver a message on behalf of the membership committee. We reviewed your pending application for the Platinum tier upgrade this morning." Helen stopped writing. Her eyes brightened. The Platinum tier was the holy grail of the Ridgewood social ecosystem. It granted access to the private dining rooms, priority booking for the upcoming holiday galas, and exclusive tea times on the championship golf course. She had been on the wait list for 3 grueling years, attending every mundane committee meeting and donating to every club-sponsored charity drive to secure her spot. "Has the board reached a decision?" Helen asked, her voice breathless with anticipation. "They have," Mr. Harrington replied. "The committee has elected to permanently suspend your application. Furthermore, your current standard membership will be placed on a probationary status effective immediately." The pen slipped from Helen's fingers, clattering against the mahogany table. The color vanished from her cheeks. The surrounding diners, who had been pretending not to listen, suddenly went very still. Suspended Helen repeated the word, catching in her throat. "Probation? On what grounds? My husband and I have been members in good standing for a decade. We follow every rule in the charter. The club maintains a strict code of conduct regarding the treatment of our guests," Mr. Harrington explained, his tone unwavering. "We pride ourselves on offering a sanctuary of respect and discretion. Your application was flagged and rejected due to your unbecoming conduct toward a VIP." Helen gasped, her hand flying to her chest. Her mind, forever trapped in its own distorted reality, immediately jumped to the wrong conclusion. She assumed the VIP in question was Marcus Sterling. "This is an outrage," Helen protested, her voice cracking as panic set in. "You cannot penalize me for that interaction. I was protecting Mr. Sterling. I was shielding him from a nuisance. You saw what happened. My daughter was making a spectacle of herself, and I stepped in to defuse the situation so a respected investor would not be bothered." Mr. Harrington looked at Helen with an expression of profound, quiet pity. He did not correct her delusion. He did not explain that Marcus Sterling was a guest, while the woman sitting quietly at the children's table was the actual target of his protective measures. Instead, Mr. Harrington shifted his gaze away from Helen. He looked directly at me. He executed a slow, subtle bow, lowering his head just enough to convey deep professional deference. It was a gesture reserved for board members, foreign dignitaries, and industry titans. "We hope the remainder of your afternoon is peaceful," Mr. Harrington said softly. Helen missed the gesture entirely. She was too busy staring at the crinkled thermal paper, paralyzed by the sudden collapse of her social aspirations. Julianne, however, caught the subtle bow. Her breath hitched, and she looked down at the floor, unable to meet my eyes. The walls of their reality were beginning to buckle, though the final collapse was still hours away. I decided the luncheon had reached its logical conclusion. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I smoothed the soft cashmere of my sweater. I walked around the table to the high chairs where my nephews sat playing with the broken green crayons. I kissed Leo on the top of his head, then leaned over and kissed Max on the cheek. They giggled, entirely untouched by the social warfare being waged above them. "Goodbye, Julianne," I said calmly. I did not address my mother. I turned and walked across the dining room, my footsteps silent on the thick carpet. I pushed through the grand mahogany doors and stepped out into the crisp autumn air. The valet brought my sedan around, and I slid behind the steering wheel. As I merged onto the highway, my thoughts seamlessly transitioned away from suburban drama. I had a schedule to keep. In less than 2 hours, I needed to be inside my Jersey City boardroom to finalize the signature parameters for a 9-figure corporate acquisition. While I drove toward the gleaming steel skyline to expand my empire, a very different kind of document was making its way through the suburban streets toward Julianne's neighborhood. It was not a restaurant receipt or a country club rejection. It was a bright pink piece of paper carried by a grim-faced process server, carrying a financial detonation that would force my family to come crawling directly into my crosshairs. The illusion of Julianne and Bradley's pristine suburban life did not slowly erode over time. It shattered on a quiet Friday morning, heralded by a single ring of the front doorbell. Julianne was standing at her kitchen island sipping a latte and reviewing a client proposal for her consulting firm. Outside, the neighborhood was perfectly manicured, quiet, and serene. When she opened the heavy oak front door, she expected a delivery driver, dropping off another package of designer clothes. Instead, a tired-looking man in a beige windbreaker stood on her welcome mat. He did not smile. He asked her to confirm her name, then handed her a folded stack of papers. The top sheet was not printed on standard white parchment. It was a glaring neon pink. It was the universal color of legal doom. Julianne closed the door and unfolded the document. The bold black lettering across the top read, "Notice of Default and Foreclosure Sale." Below the header lay a brutal accounting of her reality. She and Bradley were 6 months behind on their mortgage. The bank had exhausted all leniency. The document stated they needed $150,000 in certified funds within 48 hours to halt the public auction of their home. The country club luncheons, the bespoke suits, the private preschool tuitions, all of it was a fragile house of cards built on revolving credit lines that had finally snapped shut. Bradley earned a respectable salary at his mid-tier bank, but it was nowhere near enough to sustain the aristocratic aesthetic Julianne demanded. They had been moving debt from one ledger to another for years, hoping a sudden windfall would save them. The music had finally stopped. Panic is a cold, sharp sensation. It gripped Julianne's chest, making it difficult to breathe. She left her coffee on the counter, grabbed her car keys, and ran out the door. She drove recklessly across town to our parents' house. She did not call ahead. She burst through their front door, clutching the pink notice in her trembling hand. Richard and Helen were in the living room. Helen was still nursing the bitter sting of her country club suspension, sitting in silence while Richard stared blankly at the television. Julianne dropped the pink papers onto the coffee table. Her voice cracked as she explained the auction, the impending eviction, and the desperate need for a 6-figure cash injection. She begged Richard to pull the funds from his retirement pension. She pleaded with Helen to take out a second mortgage on their house to save her family from homelessness. A suffocating silence filled the living room. Richard did not reach for his checkbook. Helen did not offer reassuring words. Richard looked down at his shoes, unable to meet his eldest daughter's pleading gaze. Helen turned her face toward the window, her jaw tight. Slowly, the second devastating truth of the day dragged itself into the light. There was no pension left to raid. Richard cleared his throat, his voice thick with shame, and admitted that their own home equity had been drained years ago. They had refinanced 3 separate times to fund their country club dues, the luxury leased vehicles, and the relentless maintenance of their social standing. Their savings accounts were empty. They were drowning in the exact same ocean of debt, merely floating a few inches higher than Julianne. The generational transmission of financial ruin was laid bare on the living room rug. Julianne stared at her parents. The realization that there was no safety net triggered a profound shift in her psychology. When entitled people are backed into a corner, they do not accept defeat. They look for a target to exploit. Desperation is a potent catalyst, and it quickly bred a new predatory strategy. Julianne's mind raced, searching for any available lifeline. Her thoughts snagged on the events of the previous afternoon. She remembered the heavy, distinct thud of the titanium credit card hitting the mahogany table. She recalled the off-white IRS envelope she had stolen from my childhood bedroom, the one bearing a corporate tax liability with 7 zeros. Her prejudice refused to accept that I was a legitimate success, but her desperation recognized an opportunity. "She is running a scam," Julianne declared, her voice hardening with sudden conviction. "She has to be. Nobody goes from unemployed to carrying a Centurion card in a few years without breaking the law. That tax document I found is proof. She is operating a virtual shell company. She is probably laundering money or hiding assets behind a fake corporate structure." Helen grabbed onto the theory like a drowning sailor finding a piece of driftwood. "Of course it is a scam," Helen agreed. "It explains everything. That is why she was hiding at our house." Julianne's plan crystallized. It was extortion, wrapped in the guise of family duty. She explained her logic to Richard and Helen. "If I had the infrastructure to generate a fake IRS ledger, then I had a registered corporate entity. A registered entity could apply for commercial credit. They would track down the business address listed on the tax document. They would confront me in my supposed hideout. They would threaten to expose my fraudulent shell company to the federal authorities unless I used that corporate entity to take out a commercial loan. They intended to use my fake business to secure the real cash needed to halt the foreclosure auction. It was a flawless plan, provided every single one of their assumptions was correct. "We leave right now," Richard said, standing up with a renewed sense of purpose. He was eager to reclaim his authority by bullying the daughter he had just evicted. Julianne snatched the bright pink foreclosure notice off the coffee table. She folded it hastily and shoved it into the side pocket of her monogrammed leather purse. The stiff neon paper refused to stay hidden. A bright pink edge peeked out against the brown designer leather, a glaring, undeniable indicator of her impending ruin. She slung the purse over her shoulder, ignoring the visible stain on her curated image. The three of them marched out the front door, united by a shared delusion and a desperate need to survive. They climbed into Richard's leased SUV and typed the Jersey City address from the IRS letter into the navigation system. As they drove east toward the Hudson River, they rehearsed their demands. They pictured the destination waiting at the end of the route. They expected to pull into a rundown strip mall with a flickering neon sign. They prepared themselves to walk into a virtual mail drop or a dingy basement office with cheap linoleum floors. They were ready to kick down a flimsy wooden door and intimidate me into submission. They rode in arrogant silence as the suburban trees gave way to the soaring steel architecture of the financial district. They had no idea what kind of fortress was waiting for them. Richard's leased SUV navigated the narrow, shadowed streets of the Jersey City financial district. The navigation system glowing on the dashboard directed them deeper into the dense grid of towering commercial real estate. Richard gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale. Helen sat in the passenger seat, her posture rigid, her purse clutched tight against her lap. In the back seat, Julianne stared out the window, rehearsing the threats she planned to deliver. They expected the GPS to guide them toward the industrial outskirts of the city. They anticipated pulling into a crumbling asphalt parking lot, ready to confront me in a leased basement or a temporary virtual mail drop. They had spent the entire drive convincing themselves I was a desperate fraud operating a shell company to hide from creditors. The automated voice of the navigation system instructed Richard to turn right onto a pristine avenue lined with manicured urban greenery. He followed the command and brought the vehicle to a halt. The destination was not a rundown storefront. It was a soaring monolith of reinforced steel and reflective glass. The structure pierced the autumn clouds, a 50-story testament to institutional wealth. The sleek facade caught the midday sun, casting a cool, pristine glow over the manicured plaza below. A row of sleek black town cars idled near the curb, waiting for executives who dealt in global equities rather than suburban gossip. Richard shifted the car into park. He stared through the windshield, his jaw slackening. Helen leaned forward, squinting up at the sheer vertical scale of the skyscraper. "This must be the wrong address," Richard said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Check the paper again." Julianne unzipped her designer bag, brushing past the stiff, pink edge of her foreclosure notice. She pulled out the textured envelope she had stolen from my bedroom. She verified the street numbers printed beneath the federal seal. She looked back up at the imposing building. "It is the right address," Julianne replied, trying to keep her tone steady. "She is probably renting a single desk in a shared workspace on the ground floor. It is a common tactic for scam artists trying to look legitimate. The rationale was thin, but they clung to it. They climbed out of the vehicle and walked toward the entrance. The environmental clash was immediate and profound. My family operated on the currency of suburban country clubs and neighborhood HOA meetings. They derived their authority from manicured lawns and leased luxury sedans. As they stepped through the revolving glass doors of the skyscraper, their entitlement collided with actual, unyielding corporate power. The lobby was a cathedral of commerce. The floor was paved in seamless slabs of imported Italian marble, polished to a mirror finish. The acoustic design of the cavernous space absorbed the ambient noise of the city, creating a hushed, reverent atmosphere. Men and women in bespoke tailoring moved with quiet purpose, holding leather portfolios and discussing quarterly earnings. Helen's heels clicked sharply against the stone, the sound echoing a fraction too loud. She adjusted her posture, attempting to project her usual dominance, but her efforts fell flat. Against the backdrop of towering bronze pillars and minimalist modern art, her monogrammed belt and rehearsed haughtiness made her look like a lost tourist. At the center of the expansive lobby stood a long, curved security desk carved from solid black granite. 3 guards stood behind the stone barrier. They did not wear cheap polyester uniforms. They wore tailored, dark suits with subtle earpieces, projecting the quiet vigilance of trained professionals. Julianne took the lead. She marched up to the granite counter, desperate to reclaim her sense of superiority. Her consulting firm was facing a buyout. Her home was slated for public auction, and her bank accounts were draining rapidly. She needed a victim to bully, and she assumed I was waiting upstairs in a cramped cubicle. "Excuse me," Julianne said, resting her hands flat on the polished stone. Her tone carried the crisp, condescending edge she reserved for retail employees and waitstaff. "We are here to see Acacia Simmons." The security guard standing directly across from her did not flinch. He looked at Julianne, taking in her tense posture and the frantic energy radiating from her family. He rested his fingers on a sleek keyboard. "Do you have a scheduled appointment with Ms. Simmons today?" the guard asked. His voice was polite but firm, offering zero room for negotiation. Julianne offered a short, derisive laugh. She glanced back at Helen, sharing a conspiratorial smirk. "We do not need an appointment," Julianne stated, turning back to the guard. "We are her family. Just point us toward the freight elevator. She probably works in the mailroom, or maybe she rents one of those hourly virtual desks in the back corridor." The guard stopped typing. He looked at Julianne with an expression of blank, unwavering neutrality. He had spent years managing access for high-net-worth individuals. He recognized the distinct odor of baseless arrogance. He did not argue with her assessment. He did not offer a verbal correction. Instead, he raised his right hand and pointed a single finger toward the wall behind him. Mounted against the dark marble paneling was a massive digital directory. The screen was sleek and borderless, displaying the roster of corporate tenants in crisp, illuminated gold typography. Julianne followed his gesture. Helen and Richard stepped closer, narrowing their eyes to read the glowing text. The screen listed various international law firms, private equity groups, and hedge funds occupying the lower levels. As their eyes tracked upward, the names became more exclusive, indicating the tenants who commanded the highest square footage in the building. Near the very top of the digital display, occupying the premium echelon of the skyscraper, the gold letters spelled out a truth that shattered their reality into jagged pieces. Logisync AI, floors 30 through 34. Beneath the company name, a second line of text glowed with undeniable clarity. Acacia Simmons, founder and chief executive officer. The words hit them with the physical force of a tidal wave. 5 entire floors of prime commercial real estate in one of the most expensive zip codes on the eastern seaboard. The directory did not list a mailroom clerk or a temporary tenant. It listed a titan. Richard stopped breathing. He stared at the golden letters, his mind struggling to reconcile the dropout he had thrown onto the porch with the chief executive commanding 5 stories of steel and glass. Julianne felt the blood drain from her face. Her hand instinctively dropped to her purse, her fingers brushing against the leather where the pink foreclosure notice was hidden. She had come here to extort a struggling fraud. Instead, she was standing at the threshold of an empire built by the sister she had mocked her entire life. The cognitive dissonance paralyzed her. Helen, however, could not process awe. Her psychological defense mechanisms rejected the gold lettering entirely. A truth this profound threatened to destroy the very foundation of her identity. Rather than accept defeat, her confusion curdled into sudden defensive rage. "This is a typo," Helen snapped, slapping her palm against the granite desk. Her voice rose, shattering the hushed quiet of the lobby. "This is a shell company trick. She is running a scam, and you are letting her use this building to fool the government. Call her down here right now." "Ma'am, I need to ask you to lower your voice," the guard said. His polite demeanor vanished, replaced by strict operational protocol. "I will not lower my voice," Helen demanded, stepping closer to the barrier. "We are her parents. We know exactly what she is. You get on that phone and tell Acacia to come down to this lobby before I call the authorities myself." The security guard did not blink. He reached up, pressing 2 fingers against his subtle earpiece, preparing to summon additional personnel to escort the disruptive family out of the building. Before he could speak the command into his lapel microphone, a soft, melodic chime echoed across the marble floor. The sound originated from a separate bank of elevators positioned behind a velvet rope reserved exclusively for the top-tier executives. The brushed steel doors slid open with a quiet hiss. I stepped out of the private car. I wore a tailored charcoal suit, my posture relaxed, holding a pristine leather portfolio. Flanking me on either side were 2 senior corporate attorneys dressed in immaculate pinstripes, carrying briefcases filled with acquisition contracts. I stopped at the edge of the velvet rope and looked directly across the expansive lobby, locking eyes with my furious, trembling family. I did not rush toward my family. I stepped past the velvet rope and walked across the Italian marble floor with measured, calculated precision. The acoustics of the cavernous lobby amplified the steady click of my heels, a rhythmic countdown echoing against the bronze pillars. Flanking me were 2 senior corporate attorneys. They wore immaculate pinstripes and carried leather briefcases, radiating the quiet, lethal authority of men who dismantled corporations before lunch. They mirrored my pace, staying exactly 1 step behind me. My parents and my sister stood frozen near the granite security desk. The physical contrast between our 2 worlds was stark. They looked small, swallowed by the sheer scale of the financial fortress surrounding them. Richard gripped the edge of the stone counter, his knuckles pale. Julianne clutched her designer purse against her ribs like a shield. Helen was the first to break the tension. Unable to process the visual evidence of my success, her psychological defense mechanisms triggered an immediate, fierce counterattack. She stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at my chest. "Do not think this glass building fools us for 1 second," Helen hissed. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the hushed murmur of the lobby. "You can rent a fancy suit and hire actors to follow you around, but we know the truth. We saw the IRS letter." She reached into Julianne's purse, snatched the textured envelope, and held it up like a weapon. The federal seal caught the light. "You owe the government tens of millions of dollars," Helen continued, her volume rising. "You are running a Ponzi scheme. You set up a shell company to hide your assets, and you used our home address to dodge the federal investigators. We are here to tell you that we will not be dragged into your criminal mess." Julianne found her courage bolstered by our mother's delusion. She took a step forward, standing shoulder to shoulder with Helen. "We know you are broke," Julianne said. Her voice wavered, betraying the terror hiding beneath her bravado. "You need to drop this fake CEO act. You are going to sign a commercial loan using whatever fraudulent credit line you have left, or we are going to the authorities today." I stopped 3 feet away from them. I did not raise my hands in defense. I did not signal my attorneys to intervene. I let the silence stretch, allowing their desperate accusations to hang in the cool, conditioned air. My gaze shifted away from their flushed faces. I looked down at Julianne's designer leather handbag. When Helen had blindly reached inside to grab the tax document, she had disturbed the contents. Sticking out from the zippered compartment was a stiff, neon pink corner of paper. To anyone else, it was just a piece of brightly colored stationery. To an executive operating in the upper echelons of corporate finance, that specific shade of pink was universally recognizable. It was a notice of default and foreclosure sale. The pieces of the puzzle clicked together with flawless mathematical precision. They had not driven to Jersey City out of righteous indignation over my supposed tax fraud. They were not here to protect the family name. They were here because Julianne's suburban facade had finally collapsed, and she needed a six-figure bailout to save her colonial home from the auction block. They intended to extort the family failure to fund the golden child. I looked back up at Julianne. The terror in her eyes was palpable. She knew the game was over, but she lacked the capacity to stop playing. I reached into the slim leather portfolio tucked under my arm. I did not pull out a loan application or a checkbook. I extracted a single, sleek manila folder. I held the folder out toward my father. "I assume you are here about this," I said. My voice was even devoid of any discernible emotion. Richard stared at the offered folder. He hesitated, his eyes darting between my face and the heavy paper. Slowly, he reached out and took it. His hands shook, causing the stiff material to rustle softly in the quiet lobby. "Open it," I instructed. Richard lifted the flap. Inside rested a thick stack of legal documents. The top sheet was printed on heavy, archival-quality parchment. In the lower right corner, pressed deep into the fibers, was the unmistakable embossed seal of the county clerk. He pulled the document out. He adjusted his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the dense legal typography. He read the parcel number. He read the street address. He read the names listed under the original debtor column, which clearly identified Julianne and Bradley. Then his eyes dropped to the assignee column. The line designated the new legal owner of the debt. The text read, Logicink Real Estate Holdings, a subsidiary of Logicink AI. Richard's jaw went slack. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing silently, unable to form a coherent word. "What is it?" Julianne demanded, her voice shrill with panic. "What did she give you?" Julianne snatched the thick parchment from our father's trembling hands. She read the address of her own home. She saw the county seal. She saw my corporate entity listed as the primary lien holder. The truth descended upon her with crushing weight. I had not targeted her specifically. Logicink AI was expanding rapidly. To house the influx of top-tier engineering talent we were recruiting from across the country, my real estate division had recently purchased a vast portfolio of distressed residential assets from several regional lenders. Bradley's mid-tier bank happened to be one of the institutions eager to offload their toxic debts. Julianne's mortgage was buried deep inside that massive acquisition package. Her entire life, her home, her curated suburban prestige was nothing more than a minor data point in a much larger algorithm. Her debt was a rounding error in a 9-figure corporate transaction. "I literally own the roof over your head," I said. I kept my tone clinical, presenting the fact as a simple matter of business. You came here to extort a fraudulent loan from a shell company. Instead, you handed the deed to your home directly to your landlord. The power dynamic inverted with breathtaking speed. The illusion of their superiority dissolved into dust. Julianne stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the polished marble. She dropped the county document onto the floor. She wrapped her arms around her stomach, struggling to pull oxygen into her lungs, as the reality of her impending homelessness settled over her. Richard looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the impact. He stared at the marble floor, defeated, stripped of the unearned authority he had wielded over me for my entire life. Helen, however, was constitutionally incapable of accepting defeat. To acknowledge that I owned Julianne's house meant acknowledging that I was the victor. It meant admitting she had thrown a billionaire out of her home and called her uneducated trash. "This is a trick," Helen whispered, her voice trembling. "This is fake. You forged this." "You are standing in my building," I replied. "You are holding a legally binding county deed. The foreclosure auction is canceled. I own the property now. You have 30 days to vacate the premises before my legal team initiates formal eviction proceedings." Helen could not process the outcome. She turned away her face, a mask of pure, frantic denial. She pushed past Richard, marched blindly toward the revolving glass doors, and practically ran out into the bright autumn sunlight. She climbed into the passenger seat of the leased SUV and slammed the door shut. She did not cry. She did not reflect on her catastrophic mistakes. She sought the only refuge she had left. She reached into her purse, pulled out her smartphone, and prepared to launch a digital war. If she could not defeat me in the real world, she would assassinate my character in the one place she still held court. She opened the family group chat, ready to set the narrative on fire. Helen sat in the passenger seat of the leased SUV, the engine idling, while the climate control blasted cold air against her flushed face. The towering glass facade of the Jersey City skyscraper loomed in her peripheral vision, an undeniable monument to her failure. She refused to look at it. To look at the building was to acknowledge the truth. Instead, she stared down at the glowing screen of her smartphone. She tapped the messaging icon, navigating to the thread labeled Simmons Family Updates. It was a digital echo chamber containing 22 members, including aunts, uncles, cousins, and distant relations who lived out of state. It was the designated platform for sharing holiday photos and congratulating Julianne on her corporate milestones. It was also Helen's primary theater of influence. Her thumbs moved across the digital keyboard with frantic, chaotic speed. She did not pause to consider the legal implications of her words. She was operating purely on the adrenaline of survival. She needed to control the narrative before Julianne's foreclosure became public knowledge. "I need everyone to pray for our family today," Helen typed. The first message appeared in the thread, instantly triggering notification sounds across 3 different time zones. "Acacia has completely lost her mind. We just found out she has been stealing from us." She waited for the typing bubbles to appear from her sisters and cousins. Once she had their attention, she launched a nuclear strike on my character. She wove a narrative of pure fiction, blending the stolen IRS document and the county deed into a terrifying conspiracy. "She is running a criminal syndicate out of a fake office building," Helen wrote. "She committed identity theft to intercept Julianne's mortgage documents. She bribed a county official to transfer the deed into her own name. She is trying to throw her own sister onto the street to cover her illegal debts. The federal authorities are already after her. We had to flee the building because she had armed thugs threatening us in the lobby." The messages flooded the chat in rapid succession. Helen did not care that her story was illogical or that county deeds cannot be stolen through simple identity theft. She knew her audience. The extended family had been conditioned for nearly 3 decades to view me as the defective sibling. They possessed the same suburban prejudice as my parents. They accepted the fiction without asking a single verifying question. The responses poured in a chorus of righteous indignation, validating Helen's victimhood. Aunt Patricia replied first. "This is terrifying. We always knew there was something deeply wrong with her. You need to call the police immediately." Uncle Robert followed seconds later. "I am driving down there right now. No unhinged dropout is going to steal Julianne's home. I will drag her out of that fake office by her hair if I have to." Cousin Sarah chimed in with a series of crying emojis. "Julianne has worked so hard for everything she has. Acacia is just jealous and malicious. Do not let her get away with this." High above the city streets, sitting behind the vast mahogany desk in my executive penthouse office, I watched the notifications cascade across the locked screen of my phone. I picked up the device and unlocked it. I scrolled through the Simmons Family Updates thread. I read every defamatory accusation, every threat of physical violence, and every demand for my immediate arrest. The vitriol was staggering, a concentrated dose of the disdain I had quietly absorbed for 28 years. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the impulse to type a furious paragraph defending my innocence. I did not attach the Wall Street Journal article or post a photograph of my 9-figure bank statement. Defending yourself against people committed to misunderstanding you is a profound waste of cognitive energy. I held the phone in my left hand. With my right thumb and index finger, I pressed the power and volume buttons simultaneously. The device emitted a soft, rhythmic click. I captured a time-stamped screenshot of Helen's initial accusation. I scrolled down. Click. I captured Aunt Patricia's diagnostic assessment of my mental health. I scrolled again. Click. I captured Uncle Robert's explicit threat to drag me out of my office by my hair. I continued this process with slow, methodical precision. Click, click, click. I was not reading messages from my family. I was archiving digital evidence of defamation, libel, and terroristic threats. I was building an airtight legal wall, brick by digital brick. When you operate a corporate entity valued at $31 million, you do not engage in petty internet arguments. You document the infractions, hand the file to a team of litigators, and allow the judicial system to crush the offenders into dust. While I archived the evidence of their hostility, the dramatic irony within the group chat reached a boiling point. Julianne was sitting in the back seat of the SUV, staring at the pink foreclosure notice still crumpled in her hand. She watched her mother spin the elaborate lie, framing the impending eviction as a criminal conspiracy rather than a consequence of unpaid debt. The false narrative offered Julianne a temporary shield, protecting her from the shame of financial ruin. But Julianne needed to reassert her own superiority. She needed to remind the extended family that despite this terrible injustice, she remained the successful, upwardly mobile golden child. She opened the group chat on her own phone and began to type. "Do not worry about me, Mom," Julianne texted the message appearing right below a threat from Uncle Robert. "We are going to hire the best lawyers to fix this mess. Besides, I have incredible news regarding my career. My consulting firm was just acquired by a massive tech giant." She paused, ensuring everyone in the chat was reading. "The company is called Logisync AI," Julianne typed. "They are restructuring our entire division. My boss told me the new owners are bringing in unprecedented capital. I am positioned for a huge promotion and a massive salary increase. Once the ink is dry, Bradley and I will just buy a better, bigger house. Acacia can keep the old one." The extended family erupted in virtual applause. They flooded the chat with celebration emojis praising Julianne's resilience and her brilliant corporate trajectory. They congratulated her on securing a position with such a prestigious technology firm. I sat in my penthouse looking at the screen. The corner of my mouth twitched upward in a rare involuntary expression of amusement. Julianne had just bragged to 22 people that she was about to be promoted by Logisync AI. She was boasting about the massive capital and the brilliant new owners of the tech giant. She was entirely oblivious to the fact that she had just spent the last hour screaming at the founder and majority shareholder of that exact company. She had looked directly at the golden letters on the lobby directory, read the name of the corporation, and her brain had failed to connect the title on the wall with the acquisition happening at her own firm. The delusion was so absolute, it bordered on structural blindness. I took one final screenshot of Julianne's boastful declaration. I locked my phone and placed it face down on the mahogany desk. I turned my chair toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the sun dip lower over the Manhattan skyline. The corporate buyout of Julianne's consulting firm had been in negotiation for 6 grueling months. My executive team had analyzed their client roster, identified their logistical inefficiencies, and structured a hostile takeover designed to absorb their assets while liquidating their bloated upper management tier. The final signatures had been executed at dawn that very morning. The acquisition was complete. The transition phase was scheduled to begin the following day. I opened my email client and drafted a brief message to the managing partner of the newly acquired consulting branch. I informed him that the CEO of the parent company would be conducting an in-person walkthrough of the facility at 9 o'clock sharp the next morning. I instructed him to gather all senior personnel in the primary glass conference room for an introductory briefing. I hit send. The next morning, Julianne would wake up in her foreclosed colonial home. She would put on her sharpest tailored blazer. She would practice her introductory handshake in the mirror, eager to impress the billionaire tech overlords she believed were arriving to elevate her career. She would strut into her office building, completely unaware that she was walking directly into a boardroom execution designed and orchestrated by the sister she had just accused of running a criminal syndicate. The following morning, Julianne stepped off the elevator and walked into the reception area of her consulting firm. She wore a pristine cream silk blouse and a structured designer blazer. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, polished knot. She projected the image of a woman who had the world at her fingertips, burying the reality of her impending foreclosure beneath a thick layer of corporate armor. She had spent the entire night reading the celebratory messages in the family group chat. The virtual applause acted as a psychological salve, soothing the deep panic caused by the pink legal notice still sitting in her purse. She convinced herself that the events in Jersey City were an elaborate nightmare, a temporary glitch in her otherwise perfect trajectory. Today was the day her fortunes would reverse. Her firm was officially under new ownership, and she intended to secure a promotion lucrative enough to wipe her debts clean. She walked past the reception desk and entered the primary glass-walled conference room. The atmosphere inside the space was thick with high-stakes anxiety. The managing partner of the firm, David Kensington, was pacing the length of the long mahogany table. David was a man who typically exuded relaxed authority, known for playing golf on Friday afternoons and delegating the heavy lifting to his subordinates. Today, he looked like a man facing a firing squad. A thin sheen of perspiration coated his upper lip. He repeatedly loosened and tightened his silk necktie, his leather shoes squeaking against the polished hardwood floor with every frantic turn. "Take your seats," David instructed, his voice tight. The 12 senior consultants in the room quickly arranged themselves around the table. Julianne selected a chair near the head of the table, positioning herself in the direct line of sight for the incoming executives. "Listen to me very carefully," David continued, placing his hands flat on the mahogany surface. "The buyout negotiation is officially closed. The ink dried at 6 o'clock this morning. We are no longer an independent agency. We are a subsidiary of Logisync AI." A murmur of excitement rippled through the consultants, but David raised a hand to silence them. "This is not a simple merger," he warned, his eyes darting toward the frosted glass doors. "Logisync spent 6 months auditing our client roster and identifying our logistical inefficiencies. The parent company is ruthless. They are bringing in unprecedented capital, but they are also here to trim the fat. The founder and chief executive officer of Logisync is in the building right now for the inaugural walkthrough. I expect perfect decorum. I expect deference. Our careers depend entirely on her assessment today." Julianne straightened her spine, smoothing the lapels of her blazer. She checked her reflection in the dark screen of her tablet resting on the table. She felt a surge of adrenaline. This was her arena. She knew how to speak the language of corporate synergy. She was ready to dazzle the new tech overlord and secure her financial salvation. The heavy double doors of the conference room clicked the latch, releasing with a sharp, metallic snap. Every head in the room turned toward the entrance. David Kensington stood at attention, holding his breath. I walked through the doorway. I wore a tailored charcoal suit cut with exacting precision, the fabric draped flawlessly, whispering the same quiet luxury I had worn to the country club. I did not wear a name badge. I did not carry a leather designer briefcase. Tucked securely under my right arm was the scratched 2018 Dell laptop. The visual dissonance was staggering. Amidst the sleek glass walls, the imported mahogany, and the pristine presentation tablets used by the consultants, my battered computer looked like a piece of salvaged wreckage. The plastic casing was dull, the hinges were loose. Peeking out from under my arm was the edge of a peeling neon green sticker affixed to the lid. It was the exact same piece of hardware my father had called garbage when he threw my duffel bag onto his porch. I stepped into the room, letting the heavy doors swing shut behind me. The silence that descended upon the conference room was absolute. The ambient hum of the ventilation system suddenly sounded deafening. Julianne sat 2 seats away from the entrance. Her eyes locked onto my face, then darted down to the neon green sticker on the laptop. Her brain stalled. The initial wave of cognition was pure, blind outrage. She assumed I had tracked her down to continue the confrontation from the lobby the day before. She believed I was trespassing, orchestrating some kind of unhinged public stunt to humiliate her at her place of employment. Julianne opened her mouth, her hands gripping the edge of the table, preparing to shout for building security. Before a single syllable could escape her lips, David Kensington rushed forward. The managing partner of the firm did not call security. He did not demand to know why a stranger had interrupted his briefing. He stopped 3 feet away from me and executed a deep, respectful nod, his shoulders bowing in a display of total submission. Ms. Simmons David stammered, his voice trembling with eager reverence. "Welcome to the firm. We are incredibly honored to have you here. Please take the head of the table." Julianne's mouth snapped shut. The air left her lungs in a silent, agonizing rush. The collision of facts detonated inside her mind. The golden letters she had seen on the skyscraper directory the previous afternoon. LogiSync AI. Acacia Simmons, Chief Executive Officer. She had read the words, but her prejudice had prevented her from connecting the title on the wall to the acquisition happening at her own workplace. The timeline folded in on itself. The tech giant bringing the unprecedented capital. The ruthless CEO conducting the walkthrough. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. I was not a trespasser. I was the apex predator who had just swallowed her entire professional ecosystem. I owned her mortgage, and as of 6 o'clock this morning, I owned her career. I did not gloat. I did not offer Julianne a smug smile or a lingering look of triumph. I treated her with the exact same clinical indifference I applied to the polished hardwood floor. I walked past her chair, the faint scent of my perfume trailing behind me, and took my position at the head of the long table. I set the scratched Dell laptop down onto the mahogany surface. The plastic made a dull, heavy sound. David hovered near my shoulder, his hands clasped tightly together. He was desperate to prove his utility. "Can I get you anything, Ms. Simmons?" he asked, his tone radiating desperate hospitality. "A glass of sparkling water. A printed itinerary of the walkthrough, anything at all." I opened the lid of my laptop. The screen flickered to life, illuminating my face in a pale, cold glow. I let my eyes drift away from the monitor. I scanned the faces of the 12 senior consultants sitting around the table, allowing the tension to stretch until it felt brittle enough to snap. Finally, my gaze settled on Julianne. She sat frozen, her skin the color of old parchment. Her hands were shaking so severely, she had to press them flat against her thighs to hide the tremors. "Just a coffee," I said softly, my voice carrying effortlessly through the quiet room. "Black." David did not hesitate. He did not ask his executive assistant to handle the request. He turned directly toward the woman sitting 2 seats away. "Julianne." David barked, his tone shifting instantly from reverence to strict command. "Go to the executive kitchen and fetch Ms. Simmons a coffee. Make sure it is fresh." The poetic justice was a flawless geometric circle. Less than a week prior, she had stood in a country club and treated me as an unpaid nanny, demanding I sit silently at a children's table to protect her social standing. Now, sitting in the very arena where she derived all her pride and identity, her managing partner was reducing her to an errand girl. The golden child was being ordered to fetch a beverage for the uneducated trash. Julianne swallowed hard. She could not refuse the order without risking her job, the one asset she desperately needed to fight the foreclosure. She pushed her chair back, the legs scraping loudly against the floor. She stood up on trembling legs, kept her eyes focused on the carpet, and walked out of the conference room. She navigated the long, brightly lit corridor toward the executive break room. Her chest heaved with shallow, erratic breaths. She picked up a porcelain cup and placed it under the brewing machine. As the dark liquid filled the cup, the initial shock of her humiliation began to curdle into something far more dangerous. Julianne was a narcissist pushed to the absolute brink of destruction. She was losing her home, she had lost her family narrative, and now she was losing her professional dignity. Staring at the black coffee, her despair mutated into pure, venomous spite. She convinced herself that the other board members of Logisync AI could not possibly know my true background. She assumed my corporate board thought I was a legitimate tech prodigy with a pristine history. She picked up the hot porcelain cup. Her hands stopped shaking, steadied by a sudden, ruinous resolve. She decided she was not going to cower in the shadows and serve me beverages. She was going to walk back into that glass-walled room and expose the dropout to the entire executive tier. She was going to tear down my empire in front of my own subordinates, completely unaware that she was stepping directly onto the trigger of a trap she had built with her own two hands. Julianne walked back down the brightly lit corridor, gripping the porcelain saucer so tightly her knuckles ached. The heat of the black coffee radiated against her palm, a physical grounding mechanism amidst the psychological freefall of her morning. As she neared the frosted glass doors of the primary conference room, she heard my voice. The tone was calm, resonant, and entirely in control. I was outlining the integration schedule. I was explaining how Logisync AI planned to strip away the redundant managerial layers of her consulting firm and deploy predictive routing software to handle their top-tier clients. Julianne pushed the heavy doors open. I stood at the head of the mahogany table. The scratched Dell laptop was connected to the overhead projection system. Behind me, a massive digital screen displayed a complex matrix of operational analytics and equity redistribution charts. The 12 senior consultants and David Kensington sat in rapt attention, taking notes on their tablets, desperate to align themselves with the new vision. Julianne walked the length of the room. She placed the porcelain cup and saucer onto the mahogany surface near my right hand. She did not return to her seat. She remained standing, lingering in the periphery of my presentation space. I ignored her. I picked up a slim black presentation remote from the table. I continued speaking, shifting the topic to the strict behavioral and ethical standards expected under the Logisync corporate umbrella. I detailed the zero-tolerance policy for insubordination and the necessity of absolute transparency. Julianne listened to the words. The irony was too sharp, the humiliation too profound. Her mind, fractured by the impending loss of her home and the decimation of her ego, rejected reality entirely. She convinced herself that this was an elaborate charade. She believed the serious, wealthy executives sitting around the table were victims of a massive deception, blinded by the sudden influx of capital. She decided she was the sole arbiter of truth. She appointed herself the savior of the boardroom. Her restraint snapped. "She is a fraud," Julianne screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet professionalism of the room like shattering glass. The declaration echoed off the glass walls. The 12 senior consultants jolted in their leather chairs. David Kensington dropped his digital stylus. Every eye in the room snapped toward Julianne. She stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger directly at my face. Her pristine cream silk blouse hitched as her chest heaved with ragged breaths. The carefully curated mask of the Ivy League consultant evaporated, leaving behind a frantic, desperate woman standing at the edge of the abyss. "You are all being lied to," Julianne yelled, sweeping her hand toward the bewildered executives. "She is not a tech prodigy. She is my sister. She is an uneducated dropout who was living in our parents' spare bedroom less than a month ago. She built nothing. She stole my mortgage deed, and she is using your capital to run a shell company to hide from the federal government." The silence that followed was absolute. The kind of profound, suffocating quiet that occurs when a social contract is violated so egregiously that the witnesses forget how to breathe. The senior consultants stared at Julianne in horrified disbelief. In the elite echelons of corporate finance, composure is the ultimate currency. Emotional outbursts of this magnitude were career-ending events, regardless of their validity. David Kensington stood up slowly. His face had drained of all color. He looked at Julianne as if she were holding a live grenade. Julianne, David whispered, his voice trembling with sheer terror. "Sit down immediately. You are having a mental breakdown." "I am telling you the truth," she shrieked, turning her frantic gaze toward her boss. "She is unhinged. You have to stop this acquisition. She will destroy this firm." I did not flinch. I did not raise my hands to defend myself, nor did I shout over her to command order. I stood perfectly still at the head of the table. I allowed her to drain every ounce of her credibility, watching her pour her professional reputation onto the floor. When an opponent is determined to hang themselves, you do not interrupt to offer them a softer rope. When Julianne finally paused for breath, her chest heaving, the room remained dead silent. I lifted my right hand. I held the slim black presentation remote, aiming it toward the massive digital screen behind me. I pressed my thumb against the center button. The screen shifted. The complex matrix of operational analytics vanished. The projection changed to display a series of digital documents. The text was large, bold, and impossible to misinterpret. I pressed a second button on the remote. A piercing red laser dot appeared on the screen, cutting through the ambient light. I guided the red dot, circling the dates and the sender information at the top of the projected documents. The documents were email transcripts. They were the initial acquisition pitch proposals sent to the Logisync AI corporate development team 6 months prior. The emails detailed the financial vulnerabilities of David's consulting firm, outlining the redundant staffing and offering a roadmap for a hostile takeover. The sender had practically begged Logisync to purchase the agency, highlighting the potential for a massive payout for the key players involved in facilitating the deal. I moved the red laser dot slowly down the screen, resting it squarely on the signature block at the bottom of the email chain. The signature read, Julianne Simmons, Senior Consultant. The plot twist landed with the devastating force of an anvil dropping onto a glass table. The executives leaned forward, squinting at the screen, reading the undeniable proof of her treachery. Julianne had not been a victim of a sudden corporate raid. She had been the architect of it. Desperate to secure a financial windfall to save her foreclosed home, she had secretly shopped her own firm to my company, offering up her colleagues' livelihoods in exchange for a piece of the acquisition payout. She had built the very trap she was currently dying in. Julianne stared at the screen. The color vanished from her lips. She recognized her own words, her own digital signature, projected 10 feet high for her colleagues to dissect. The realization that I had known her plan for half a year, that I had read her desperate pitches while she was busy mocking my cheap clothes and calling me a failure, broke the final remaining pillar of her sanity. "She betrayed you all," I said quietly. My voice was even cutting through the stunned silence. She solicited this acquisition to cover her personal debts, and now, unable to accept the reality of her new corporate structure, she is displaying gross insubordination in a professional setting. I turned my gaze away from Julianne and looked directly at David Kensington. He was staring at the emails, his expression hardening from terror into pure, unadulterated disgust. The woman he had trusted, the consultant he had mentored, had tried to sell his firm for parts. "David," I said, maintaining the quiet, lethal tone of absolute authority, "as the founder and majority shareholder of this entity, I require a stable and professional environment to execute this transition." I paused, letting the silence stretch for 2 seconds. "Terminate her." The third-party execution was immediate and flawless. I did not have to raise my voice or sully my hands with the mechanics of her dismissal. The board of executives, the very people Julianne had tried to recruit to her delusional cause, turned their collective wrath upon her. David Kensington did not hesitate. The deference he had shown me earlier solidified into decisive action. He picked up his desk phone, pressed a single button, and spoke 3 words to the reception desk. "Call building security." He placed the receiver down and looked at Julianne. His voice was cold, devoid of any former warmth or professional camaraderie. "You are fired," David stated the words, sharp and final. "Your severance is void due to gross misconduct and breach of fiduciary duty. Do not touch your tablet. Do not return to your desk. You will wait in the reception area until security escorts you out of this building." Julianne did not argue. The fight had been entirely drained from her body. The crushing weight of the evidence, the silent disgust of her peers, and the brutal finality of her termination stripped away her remaining defenses. She looked at me one last time. There was no hatred left in her eyes, only the hollow, vacant stare of a woman who had finally realized the true altitude of the cliff she had stepped off. She turned around and walked out of the conference room. 2 burly security guards in dark uniforms met her in the reception area. They flanked her on either side, guiding her toward the elevator banks. They did not allow her to collect her personal belongings or say goodbye to her colleagues. She was marched out of the corporate arena, her pristine cream silk blouse and structured blazer offering no protection against the reality of her absolute ruin. She would walk out into the daylight, unemployed, facing imminent foreclosure with her professional reputation reduced to ashes. She would retreat to the suburbs, crying in her car, and drive straight to our parents' house. Her arrival, stripped of her golden child status, would finally force our father to sit down at a computer and search for the truth he had been avoiding for 4 weeks. Julianne drove back to the suburbs in a state of sensory deprivation. She did not turn on the radio. She did not notice the changing traffic lights or the other vehicles merging along the highway. Her hands gripped the leather steering wheel with rigid, white-knuckle tension, guiding her car through sheer muscle memory. The corporate armor she had worn so proudly that morning had been stripped away, leaving nothing but the hollow shell of a ruined woman. She pulled into the driveway of her parents' house. She did not bother to check her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her pristine cream silk blouse was wrinkled. Her severe polished knot of hair had loosened strands falling across her pale face. She walked up the brick pathway, pushed the front door open, and stepped into the quiet foyer. Richard and Helen were sitting in the living room drinking coffee and waiting for updates on the buyout. They expected Julianne to walk through the door carrying news of a lucrative promotion, a financial lifeline that would save her colonial home and eventually rescue them from their own mounting debts. Julianne dropped her purse onto the floor. The heavy leather slumped against the hardwood, the pink foreclosure notice still protruding from the side pocket. She collapsed onto the floral sofa, buried her face in her hands, and began to sob. The sound was not a delicate performative cry. It was a guttural, jagged expression of total defeat. Helen set her coffee cup down, the porcelain clattering against the saucer. She rushed to her eldest daughter's side, placing a hand on her shaking shoulders. Richard stood up, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What happened?" Helen asked, her voice tight with rising panic. "Did the merger fall through? Did they let your boss go?" Julianne shook her head, unable to speak through the tears. It took her several minutes to pull enough oxygen into her lungs to form a coherent sentence. When she finally lifted her head, her makeup was smeared, tracing dark paths down her cheeks. "I was escorted out by security," Julianne choked out. "They fired me. They voided my severance." Richard's confusion morphed into cold, sharp dread. "Fired," he repeated, taking a step closer to the sofa. "On what grounds? You are their top consultant. Who gave that order?" Julianne looked at her father. Her eyes were hollow, vacant of the unearned superiority that had defined her entire existence. "She gave the order," Julianne whispered. "Acacia." The name hung in the living room air, a toxic syllable that poisoned their suburban sanctuary. Helen opened her mouth to protest, ready to launch into another tirade about shell companies and stolen identities. Richard held up his hand, silencing his wife. The denial that had shielded his ego for 4 weeks finally fractured. The sheer impossibility of a dropout executing a corporate termination in a high-rise boardroom was too vast to ignore. The elaborate lies Helen had spun in the group chat could no longer withstand the crushing weight of reality. Richard turned his back on the weeping women. He walked out of the living room and marched down the hallway toward his home office. The room was a relic of their fading middle-class stability, filled with dark oak furniture and framed photographs of country club outings. Richard sat down in the leather desk chair. He reached out and shook the computer mouse. The monitor woke from its sleep state, casting a pale, cold blue glow across his aging features. He opened a web browser. His hands hovered over the keyboard. For 28 years, he had never once felt the need to investigate his youngest child's activities. He had dismissed my late nights of coding as a pointless distraction. Now his fingers trembled as he typed my name into the search bar, followed by the company title Julianne had provided. Acacia Simmons, Logisync AI. He hit the enter key. Richard braced himself, half expecting to find obscure forum posts or pending criminal indictments, praying for anything that would validate his decision to throw me onto the porch. The search results flooded the screen in a fraction of a second. There were no gossip blogs. There were no scam alerts. The page was dominated by Tier 1 financial journalism. The very institutions Richard read every Sunday morning to inform his modest stock portfolio were suddenly staring back at him, bearing his disgraced daughter's name. Wall Street Journal, Forbes, TechCrunch, Bloomberg. The blue light of the monitor illuminated the deep lines around Richard's mouth as he clicked the topmost link. It was a featured profile piece published by the Wall Street Journal just 3 weeks prior. The bold black headline stretched across the top of the digital page. Acacia Simmons, 28, secures $31 million valuation for supply chain AI built from her childhood bedroom. Richard stopped breathing. He scrolled down the page, his eyes tracking the dense columns of text. The reporter detailed the meteoric rise of the software, describing the revolutionary predictive routing algorithms that were currently disrupting global shipping networks. The article praised my relentless work ethic, noting the lack of traditional venture capital backing in the early stages. Then Richard reached the third paragraph. The text described the origins of the enterprise. The journalist wrote about the cramped suburban bedroom facing a wooden fence, the endless nights of coding, and the battered 2018 Dell laptop that served as the initial server for the entire platform. The reporter referred to that scratched plastic computer as a piece of iconic tech history, a symbol of pure, unyielding grit. Richard stared at the words. He remembered standing in the foyer screaming at me, calling the very machine the Wall Street Journal was praising a piece of garbage. He remembered calling me uneducated trash. Helen appeared in the doorway of the home office. She had left Julianne crying on the sofa. She walked up behind her husband, resting her hands on the back of his leather chair. She looked over his shoulder, her eyes scanning the glowing screen. She read the headline. She saw the strings of numbers detailing the Series B funding round. She looked at the high-resolution photograph of my face embedded in the article, taken during a recent tech summit in Manhattan. I was wearing the same quiet luxury cashmere I had worn to the country club. The reality of the situation crashed down upon them with the force of a collapsing building. They were deeply, irreversibly in debt. Their home equity was drained. Their golden child was unemployed, facing imminent foreclosure. Her career reduced to ashes. Meanwhile, the daughter they had starved of affection, the child they had cast out into the autumn night, was an untouchable titan commanding a vast fortune. In a rational family, this realization would trigger profound remorse. A normal parent would pick up the telephone, call their child, and beg for forgiveness. They would apologize for their blindness, their cruelty, and their suffocating prejudice. But Richard and Helen were incapable of genuine contrition. To apologize meant surrendering their authority. It meant admitting their entire worldview was flawed and that their social posturing was a hollow sham. Narcissism is a survival instinct, and in the face of absolute exposure, their minds executed a terrifying pivot. They did not feel regret. They felt a visceral, consuming terror of social ruin. If the women at the country club read this article, Helen whispered, her voice tight with panic, if the neighborhood association finds out we threw a billionaire out of our house and called her a failure, we will be finished. We will be the laughingstock of this town. They will exile us. Richard nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the blue screen. We cannot let that happen. Helen straightened her posture. Her despair hardened into cold, calculating strategy. The truth was already out there in the digital ether. They could not delete the Wall Street Journal. They could not force me to sign over my wealth. There was only one viable option left to salvage their suburban prestige. They had to rewrite history. They needed to present themselves not as the cruel oppressors who evicted me, but as the loving, supportive architects of my success. They needed the local society to believe they had funded my startup, fostered my genius, and provided the stable foundation from which my empire grew. If they could publicly tether their name to my fortune, the community would overlook their impending financial collapse, assuming my wealth would eventually trickle down to sustain them. Helen reached over Richard's shoulder and took control of the computer mouse. She opened a new search tab. "We need to find her," Helen commanded. "We need to be seen with her in public, on the record, before Julianne's foreclosure hits the local papers. We have to claim our piece of this story." She typed my name into the search engine again, filtering the results by recent news and upcoming events. She scanned the local press releases, ignoring the dense financial data, in favor of society pages and philanthropic announcements. Within minutes, she found the target. A local news outlet had published an itinerary for the upcoming Willow Creek Children's Hospital Charity Gala scheduled for that very weekend. The article highlighted the primary benefactor of the event. Acacia Simmons, CEO of Logisync AI, was the guest of honor, slated to be interviewed on the red carpet regarding her recent $2 million donation to the pediatric wing. Helen released the mouse. A slow, sickening smile spread across her face. The panic in her eyes was replaced by the glittering anticipation of a fresh manipulation. "She is going to be surrounded by the press," Helen said, her tone dripping with rehearsed warmth. "The mayor will be there. The local news stations will be broadcasting live. It is the perfect venue." Richard turned in his chair, looking up at his wife. "What are you planning?" Helen walked over to the wooden filing cabinet in the corner of the office. She opened the bottom drawer, her mind already drafting the script for her ultimate performance. "We are going to that gala," Helen declared. "We are going to walk right onto that red carpet, stand beside our brilliant daughter, and show the entire state of New Jersey exactly who built the foundation of her empire. We will give the reporters a story they cannot resist." She planned a sickening ambush, a public spectacle designed to trap me in the glare of the flashbulbs, forcing me to either accept her fabricated narrative or appear ungrateful on live television. She believed her presence would paralyze me. She was banking on the old, silent obedience she had conditioned into me since childhood. She had no idea that the quiet girl she had evicted was dead, and the woman waiting on that red carpet was armed, prepared, and ready to detonate their entire world. The Willow Creek Children's Hospital Charity Gala was a symphony of curated philanthropy and undeniable wealth. The grand ballroom of the historic estate was draped in emerald velvet, illuminated by 3-tiered crystal chandeliers that cast a warm golden glow over the attendees. I stood at the apex of the crimson-red carpet near the entrance, wearing a floor-length silk gown in a deep sapphire hue. The fabric pooled elegantly around my heels, whispering with every subtle movement. The air hummed with the sound of a string quartet playing in the corner, their notes mingling with the low, steady murmur of the state's most influential figures. I was not standing on that carpet to network or to seek validation. I was the guest of honor. My corporate entity, Logisync A, I had just wired $2 million to the hospital foundation to fund a new predictive logistics network for the pediatric transplant unit. The investment would optimize the delivery routes for critical medical supplies, ensuring life-saving resources arrived with zero latency. It was a mathematical solution applied to a fragile human problem. The hospital board had organized this elaborate evening to publicly acknowledge the contribution, drawing the attention of local politicians, industry peers, and regional media. A line of journalists and photographers stood behind a velvet rope barrier, their lenses focused directly on me. Microphones bearing the logos of the state broadcast networks were extended in my direction. The press was hungry for the narrative. They wanted the compelling human interest story of the tech founder who emerged from a quiet suburban background to build a $31 million software empire. Just as a lead reporter from the primary news station stepped forward to initiate the interview, a sudden commotion erupted at the far end of the red carpet. The velvet rope swayed. A hired security guard stepped forward, raising his hand, but he was too late to halt the intrusion. Helen Richard and Julianne pushed their way through the throng of photographers, ignoring the polite protests of the event coordinators. Their arrival was a jarring disruption to the orchestrated elegance of the evening. Richard trailed near the back of the trio, his shoulders hunched inside an outdated black tuxedo. He looked like a man walking toward a guillotine, his eyes darting nervously toward the exit doors. He knew the truth about my wealth and his own financial ruin, and the public exposure terrified him. Julianne flanked our mother on the right. The former corporate consultant wore a stiff evening dress, but her posture betrayed her internal collapse. Her face was pale, stripped of the unearned superiority that had defined her existence just 48 hours prior. She kept her gaze fixed on the crimson fabric beneath her shoes, unable to look at the cameras, the crowd, or me. She was a defeated pawn, dragged to this event by a mother refusing to surrender. Helen, however, fed on the attention. She marched down the red carpet with the frantic energy of a cornered predator. She wore a sequined dress that caught the glare of the flashbulbs, her porcelain smile fixed rigidly in place. She had spent the last 2 days crafting this desperate illusion. Her home equity was gone, her eldest daughter's career was ashes, and her social standing was hanging by a thread. She was determined to execute her final performance on live television to secure her survival. In her hands, Helen carried a physical prop. It was a custom-made plaque hastily ordered from a local trophy shop in the suburbs. The frame was cheap plastic painted to resemble polished brass, a stark contrast to the genuine wealth surrounding her. Engraved across the center in large cursive lettering was a staggering fabrication. Simmons Family, Foundation of Success. Before the security detail could intervene and remove the uninvited guests, Helen breached the interview perimeter. She stepped directly into the focal length of the broadcasting cameras. She closed the distance between us and threw her right arm around my shoulders. The sudden physical contact was jarring. The heavy scent of her vanilla musk perfume filled my lungs, a smell I associated entirely with childhood reprimands, rigid expectations, and conditional approval. Her fingers dug into the delicate silk fabric of my gown, gripping my shoulder with a desperate warning pressure. She was silently commanding me to play along. She was banking on the old, quiet obedience she thought still resided within my mind. She believed the protocol of high society would paralyze me. I did not flinch. I did not shrug her arm away, nor did I signal the guards to remove her. I stood perfectly still, my posture straight, my expression an unreadable mask of calm detachment. When an adversary builds a stage to broadcast their own delusion, the most lethal response is to grant them the microphone. Helen turned her blinding smile toward the lenses. "We are so proud of our daughter," Helen proclaimed. Her voice was pitched to ensure every microphone in the vicinity captured the audio. She projected the warmth of a devoted matriarch, painting a masterpiece of revisionist history for the viewing audience. "She is a visionary," Helen continued, squeezing my shoulder for emphasis. But every visionary needs a strong foundation. We supported her every single step of the way. We gave her a loving home, a quiet space to build her dreams, and the unwavering encouragement she needed to change the world. It takes a family to build an empire, and the Simmons family has always stood united behind Acacia. A rapid succession of bright white bursts erupted from the press line. The rapid, blinding flashes of the press cameras captured the lie in high definition. The photographers documented the heartwarming image of a successful tech founder embracing the mother who had supposedly nurtured her genius. To the untrained eye, it was the perfect, heartwarming American success story. The lead reporter, charmed by the sudden display of maternal affection, smiled warmly. She held her microphone closer, eager to capture my response to this touching tribute. She looked at the cheap plastic plaque in Helen's hand, then shifted her gaze to my face. "Tell us, Acacia," the reporter asked, her tone light and inquisitive. "How instrumental were your parents in your $31 million journey?" Helen beamed, her grip tightening on my shoulder. She waited for me to deliver the rehearsed platitudes. She expected me to thank her, to validate the plaque, and to secure her social standing in front of the entire state. She was confident I would not risk a public scandal by contradicting her on live television. I let the silence stretch for 3 deliberate seconds. I looked at the reporter, then down at the microphone. I reached my left hand into the silk clutch resting at my side. My fingers brushed past the heavy titanium American Express Centurion card. I bypassed the keys to my penthouse and the corporate security fob. I wrapped my hand around the smooth glass of my smartphone and pulled it out into the glaring light of the flashbulbs. I did not look at my mother. I unlocked the screen of my smartphone with a single swipe of my thumb. I navigated to a specific audio file stored in my digital archives. It was a voicemail left on my device precisely 28 days prior. My father had called me 10 minutes after throwing my canvas duffel bag onto his front porch, intending to deliver one final lecture to ensure I understood my lowered rank in his hierarchy. I held the phone directly against the foam wind guard of the reporter's microphone. The broadcast equipment was wired into the grand ballroom's primary audio system, connecting to a network of high-fidelity speakers positioned around the perimeter of the room. I pressed the play icon. The digital audio file engaged. A brief burst of static hissed through the overhead speakers, cutting through the elegant music of the string quartet. The static was followed immediately by the harsh, abrasive tone of my father's voice. "Leave now, you uneducated trash," the recording echoed across the velvet-draped walls. The volume was unforgiving. It broadcast his raw contempt to the wealthiest individuals in the state, stripping away the refined atmosphere of the charity gala. "You are a loser and a permanent stain on this family," the recorded voice continued, the anger vibrating through the pristine acoustics. "Do not ever call us for money. We are done funding a dropout. Get off my property." The recording ended with a sharp digital click. I lowered my hand, slipping the smartphone back into my silk clutch. The silence that descended over the charity gala was suffocating. It was not the respectful quiet of a captivated audience. It was the stunned, breathless paralysis of a society witnessing a brutal public unmasking. The musicians in the corner had lowered their instruments. The waiters holding trays of crystal champagne flutes stood frozen in place. The mayor of the city, standing a few yards away, stared at the red carpet with his mouth slightly open. Helen's hand went limp. Her fingers, which had been digging into the delicate silk of my gown just moments before, released their grip. Her arm fell uselessly to her side. The porcelain smile shattered, replaced by a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. She looked around the room, meeting the wide, judgmental eyes of the local politicians, the hospital board members, and the regional journalists. She realized instantly that her fabricated narrative was dead. There was no charm or social maneuvering that could erase the audio the entire room had just absorbed. Richard recoiled. He physically shrank, taking a clumsy step backward until his shoulders bumped against the velvet rope of the press barrier. He heard his own cruel words bounce off the crystal chandeliers. He understood that his reputation, the suburban facade he had guarded so carefully for decades, was now reduced to ash. Julianne closed her eyes. She did not move a muscle. She accepted the reality that their public execution had finally arrived. She had lost her career and her home, and now she was losing her anonymity. The lead reporter stared at me. She lowered her microphone, her journalistic instincts struggling to process the sudden narrative pivot. She had asked a simple question about parental support, expecting a heartwarming soundbite. I had delivered undeniable proof of parental abuse. I did not leave the reporter empty-handed. I opened the gold clasp of my clutch once more. I retrieved a custom-bound presentation packet. The cover was constructed from thick, matte black cardstock. I extended my arm and handed the dossier directly to the journalist. The transfer of the documents produced a distinct tactile sound. It was the heavy, satisfying rustle of thick, archival-quality paper sliding against itself. It was the sound of irrefutable evidence changing hands. The reporter took the packet, her fingers tracing the smooth binding. She opened the cover, her eyes scanning the top page. Inside those pages, you will find time-stamped digital correspondence I explained. My voice remained even, carrying the calm authority of a chief executive delivering a quarterly earnings report. The first section contains messages distributed by my mother to our extended relatives. In those texts, she fabricates a narrative wherein I run a criminal syndicate and steal real estate. The surrounding journalists leaned in their camera lenses, zooming past the velvet rope to capture the text on the glossy pages. They photographed the printed group chat screenshots. The second section, I continued, contains the official county deed to my sister's colonial home. My corporate entity recently purchased her mortgage from a distressed asset portfolio, preventing her imminent foreclosure. She attempted to extort me using the very debt I now own. The press line erupted into a frenzy of motion. They photographed the county seal on the foreclosure documents. The truth was now a matter of public record, immune to any further suburban spin. The reporters recognized the magnitude of the story. It was no longer a simple piece about a charitable donation. It was a staggering exposé of greed, delusion, and corporate retribution. I looked directly into the lens of the primary broadcast television camera. I built my company despite them, I said clearly, ensuring every syllable was captured by the recording equipment. Not because of them. The third-party execution was swift and merciless. I did not have to hurl insults. I did not have to raise my voice or display an ounce of anger. The reality of the evidence handled the retribution on my behalf. The reporters, sensing the true scope of the scandal, pivoted in unison. The entire press line turned their lenses away from me. They aimed their flashes and their microphones directly at my parents. The cameras documented Helen's terrified, pale face as she shielded her eyes from the blinding bursts of light. They captured Richard's cowardly retreat as he tried to hide behind his eldest daughter. The local society they so desperately wanted to impress was now watching their downfall in real time. The event coordinators finally recovered from their initial shock. Two men in dark suits, the head of the hospital security detail, stepped past the velvet rope. They did not ask politely. They grasped Richard by his elbows, pulling him away from the press line. They flanked Helen and Julianne, forming a physical barrier between the disgraced family and the gala attendees. The guards began to march the trespassing family back down the crimson carpet, directing them toward the heavy exit doors. As the security personnel escorted Helen away, her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Her grip on her fabricated prop failed. The custom-made plaque slipped from her fingers. It hit the hardwood floor, landing face up on the red carpet. She did not stop to retrieve it. She allowed the guards to push her out of the ballroom, vanishing into the cold autumn night, leaving her false narrative abandoned on the ground. She would return to a life of insurmountable debt and social exile, forever known as the woman who threw away a titan. The lead reporter looked down at the discarded item, then looked back at me, her expression reflecting deep professional respect. I did not bend down to pick up the plastic frame. I adjusted the drape of my sapphire gown. I turned my body, preparing to rejoin the hospital board members waiting near the main dining area. I took a step forward. My heel came down squarely on the center of the fake brass frame. The cheap plastic cracked beneath my weight, snapping in two with a sharp, hollow sound that echoed briefly over the music. I did not look back at the broken pieces. I walked away from the red carpet, leaving the remnants of my family behind me. I stepped into the warm glow of the chandeliers, greeted by the respectful nods of my billionaire peers, my empire secure, and my peace permanently restored. There is a profound, often unspoken truth about the architecture of a family. The foundation you lay for your children in their quietest, most vulnerable years is the exact structure you will be forced to live inside when the seasons of your life inevitably change. We are taught to believe that a family home is an unshakable sanctuary, a place where unconditional love acts as the mortar between the bricks. But as the story of Acacia Simmons vividly illustrates, sometimes the walls of a home are not built with love at all. Sometimes they are built with pride, conditional affection, and a desperate, suffocating need to maintain social appearances. And when a storm finally comes, a house built on illusions will always collapse under the weight of reality. When we reflect on the spectacular downfall of Richard, Helen, and Julianne, it is easy to focus solely on the financial ruin and the boardroom executions. The crushed plastic plaque and the foreclosed colonial mansion make for a satisfying cinematic resolution. But beneath the surface of the corporate buyouts and the titanium credit cards lies a much deeper, more urgent lesson about parenting values and the immense gravity of family responsibility. In modern American culture, the pressure to succeed is relentless. Parents often find themselves caught in the exhausting current of keeping up with the neighborhood, equating their children's achievements with their own personal worth. Richard and Helen fell into the most toxic iteration of this trap. They did not look at their two daughters and see two distinct, capable human beings with different paths to walk. They saw a ledger of social currency. Julianne, with her Ivy League acceptance and her corporate consulting career, was an asset to be paraded in front of the country club. Acacia, hunched over a scratched laptop at 3 a.m, writing the code that would eventually change the world, was deemed a liability, simply because her genius did not come with a recognizable, easily digestible label. This is where the true failure of their parenting occurred. It was not just a lack of financial support, it was a total absence of emotional awareness and basic fairness. When parents designate a golden child and a scapegoat, they do not just harm the child who is cast aside, they quietly destroy the favored child as well. Julianne was given a luxury vehicle, endless praise, and the illusion of invincibility. But she was never taught honesty, resilience, or the ethical grit required to survive when the applause stops. She was trained to rely on entitlement rather than character. When her life began to unravel, she did not have the moral foundation to rebuild it. She only knew how to lie, steal, and extort to maintain her facade. The parents who thought they were giving her everything had, in reality, left her entirely defenseless against the real world. Conversely, Acacia was starved of validation, insulted, and eventually evicted. Yet, in the cruelest of ironies, it was the coldness of her household that forged her unbreakable resolve. She learned early on that her worth would never be handed to her on a silver platter. She had to build it herself, line by line, algorithm by algorithm, in the quiet solitude of a bedroom that faced a wooden fence. But should a child have to survive their own parents to become strong? True family responsibility requires the emotional maturity to see your children for who they are, not who you need them to be for the sake of a neighborhood audience. It requires the honesty to admit when a child's path diverges from tradition, and the fairness to nurture that path with the same enthusiasm you would give to a more conventional route. A traditional family structure is only as strong as its commitment to the truth. When parents prioritize a curated image over the genuine well-being and ethical development of their children, they plant the seeds of their own inevitable exile. If you have ever felt like the outsider in your own living room, or if you have ever had to build your life from the scraps your family left behind, you understand the quiet, heavy strength that Acacia carried. You know what it costs to walk away in silence, and you know the undeniable peace that comes from finally reclaiming your dignity. That is exactly why we share these journeys. We invite you to subscribe and follow our channel, Olivia Stories Revenge, where we continue to explore these deep, complex family dynamics. Join our community of listeners who understand that sometimes the most profound revenge is simply building a beautiful, untouchable life, despite the people who said you never could. The story of the Simmons family asks us to look closely at the legacy we are leaving behind. Parenting is the longest investment a human being can make, and the returns are measured not in dollars, but in the character of the adults we send out into the world. Helen and Richard spent decades cultivating a pristine image, sacrificing their youngest daughter's dignity to keep their social status afloat. But when the dust settled, their unearned pride left them standing on a sidewalk in the cold, locked out of the empire their own child had built, surrounded by the ruins of the daughter they had spoiled into incompetence. It makes you stop and look around your own dining room table. It makes you examine the conversations you have with the people you are supposed to protect. Are you building a foundation of honesty, fairness, and true emotional support? Or are you polishing a fragile glass house, hoping the neighbors never look too closely at the cracks? In the end, the children we raise will eventually become the authors of our final chapters. They will hold the pen, and they will write the truth of who we really were. When your time comes and the ink touches the paper, what kind of story will your children tell? Will they write about a home that was a sanctuary? Or will they simply close the book, lock the door, and walk away without ever looking back?